5 chilling true camping stories featuring Black Cleric. A link to his channel will be in the description. Haven't been camping since, by Burn Witness. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and were stuck living together after the breakup as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping, fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forest, farmers' fields and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a pretty good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched, yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment, listening, and then started to play on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these type of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters, not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine a flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me, and babbled, "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies, but I've never seen someone look that scared. And I never want to see that expression on someone's face again, so I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms' lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy, if the making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to fuck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. Seriously, fuck off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're going to call the cops. With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, sounding like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified, until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we really haven't ever talked about it since that day. Close Camping by Chris Britt. When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed onto a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in my back garden, which apart from a 6-foot wooden fence, was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into Action Man figures at the time, we decided we would make the tent a hideout. So we got together some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it a bit stealthier. We also put the tent in the corner of the back garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of crisps and sweets before we decided to try and get some sleep in our well-hidden, super dark tent. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on small stones. I then realized that below the fence my mum and dad had decorated with some gravel and flower pots. At first I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise from my sleeping bag. Then I heard it again. I once again tried to make my way to the front of the tent, silently, and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were 2 guys, dressed all in black, crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen, talking to each other. I immediately froze and had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for more windows or maybe an entrance. Because we were both in the corner of the garden, we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our house, where there was a door into the adjoined garage. I heard them talking quite clearly, as now they were less than 5 feet away from me and my friend, who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen and just taking whatever they could find in the garage, instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while as it was very early. As soon as the phone rang, the 2 people bolted to the fence and hopped over. My dad then answered, and I whispered for him to get outside ASAP with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I'm glad my friend slept silently. Camping Horror by M. Joe Alley, narrated by Black Cleric.
This happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They were in their mid-20s when this all occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking around the campsite, so she went and quietly told my dad that she heard someone walking around. They noped out of there, just in case. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off so they wouldn't be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp and began to drink, while listening to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure that this next event is connected to the first, but they believe it is. So, they settled in and my dad was asleep far before my mom. My mom was in the halfway state where you're halfway awake and halfway asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to consciousness and listened. She tried waking my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened for what seemed like hours. when suddenly she hears, in the creepiest voice you could probably ever imagine, say, "Here I am. I'm going to kill you." While saying this, the man ran what she believes to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or even move. With her mouth agape, she finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab the shotgun!" With that, my dad finally awoke. They heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps and heard the guy running away. Of course, my parents didn't have a shotgun. It was a huge bluff that actually worked. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were getting out of there before anything else could happen, when they saw that their tires had been slashed. They were in the middle of nowhere and no way out with some mechanic that wanted to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tires with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously, that didn't work, but they had to try, right? About an hour or so later, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along and helped them out. He brought them back to town so they could get their tires fixed. While talking to the ranger, they found out that they had been searching for any suspicious activity due to recent murders nearby. My parents were likely the murderer's next victims.
Creeped Home While Camping by Blood Blots. I travelled with 2 friends through Europe, ending in Israel. We were all secular tourists, Australian, female, and 19. There had been discussion about going to the Dead Sea, located in the West Bank. I had researched it heavily, posting on Lonely Planet and travel advisor forums about safety. Being budget backpackers, we were advised online to grab a tent and camp right on the sea in a well-known campground patrolled by an armed guard, with high fencing and barbed wire. We decided to reserve judgment until we got to Jerusalem. We asked locals when pressed about whether we would actually be in danger. Most scoffed and said, "Of course not." We even stopped at a local youth hostel once in the area and asked. They assured us it would be fine. We set up camp, checked in with the security guard, unusually young, good-looking, and spoke impeccable English, and decided to have an early night. Given that we had made ourselves known and that no one else except an old man was staying at the campsite, we felt safe. We played Louis C.K.'s stand-up on my iPad while we waited to get tired. At around 11, I began to hear shuffling outside. It is worth noting that we had got the cheapest tent possible and that the window straps for it were thus on the outside. We had velcroed them closed before we went inside. The shuffling continued past the tent, and I assumed someone else had made it to the camp late and was probably setting up. I pressed play again while my friends teased me for being paranoid. About 10 minutes later, the sound of crunching steps in the ground came back, more deliberate this time. My friends heard it too, and we paused the stand-up, all of us poised, still, and listening. The crunching stopped as the noise from our tent did, and then started up. It sounded like the guy moved around our tent in a semicircle, then retraced his footsteps. Again, we heard him retreating towards the beach. At this point, we were a tad spooked. Maybe he was lost, maybe he was looking for the bathroom, became our accepted hypothesis, and we went back to watching Louis. Not 5 minutes later, the footsteps came back, louder, far more deliberate. He wanted us to hear him. We paused the stand-up immediately. We were all still for a good minute, and he, outside, was still too. We could hear him. We were scared at this point. We hadn't brought weapons with us, but we were confident the guard would hear us if we screamed out. Zed, my bravest and most skeptical friend, called out to him. "Hello, who is it? What do you want?" We heard his breath catch at us attempting to contact, but he said nothing back. We all gasped as we saw his fingers begin to deliberately brush against the side of our tent, grazing Zed. I tried a despairing and far less assured, "Who are you?" At this point, we were desperate for him to answer, to not be what we thought he was. He didn't reply. Instead, slow and deliberate as his footsteps, he began to unfurl and roll up one of our tent window flaps. It was dark outside. We could not see his face. I said slowly and quietly to my friends, "On three, we began screaming for help, loud as possible. Don't stop until the guard comes." We began to shriek a terrified cacophony of helps. It was honestly one of the most jarring noises I've ever heard, and it was coming from me. There was something so animalistic about the way we sounded. We were calling for someone, anyone, to help us from this predator. Eventually, far in the distance towards the guard's quarters, we heard someone answer in English. "What? What's happening?" We zipped out of our tent. My two friends ran straight towards the man who answered. I ran diagonal from them, picking up rocks and a stick to defend myself with. They turned out to be guards from a local kibbutz, filling up their water supply. They had flashlights and a gun. We told them what had happened, and they shone lights around our tent. Sure enough, in the sand were boot prints in a semicircle all around our tent. The most disturbing were the ones heavy in the toe, when the dude had been essentially leaning with all of his weight forward to see in on us. He'd also rolled up another window flap, unbeknownst to us, probably when he was making particularly loud footsteps. Paranoid as I am, I scrutinized the boot prints of these guards with the ones around our tent. They did not remotely match. They followed the footprints, and they led to a set of 3 more. The guy had been a lookout for 3 dudes, and in the words of the kibbutz guards, we could have been robbed or worse. The PS to this story is, we breathlessly went to tell the guard what had happened, only to find him stoned out of his mind, watching Hey Arnold reruns. Fucking A, man. Woods of Northern Wisconsin by Windy City 13. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in Chicamacan National Forest in northern Wisconsin, and after our experience, we do not plan to return unless we go with a large group of friends. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for R&R. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin and in the UP, but never to this area. We're not backpacking experts, but we've been to a number of national parks and have been out hiking and exploring when we can find time away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the North Country Trail. The North Country Trail is a national scenic trail like the Appalachian Trail, but it gets much less use. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is via logging roads. We plan to hike 15 miles along this trail to a backpack shelter, spend the night, and hike back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Wasau, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forests. I drove slowly along the gravel logging roads as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trail road, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted out, bunged up pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed they were still staring at us, and before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again and saw them watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about the up north people, but we did not think anything of the encounter. Aside from those people, we didn't encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the national forest boundary. We found the trailhead about 15 minutes later after winding our way on the narrow logging road. There was no one else parked at the trailhead, a perfect chance to get some needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure the car was locked, we hoisted our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent in a small clearing about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter fire ring, and I boiled water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. My girlfriend and I passed around a Nalgene filled with wine, and we marveled at how many stars you could see away from the city. When the fire was reduced to a small pile of glowing embers, we decided to head back to the tent. We settled into our tent and looked for the pictures we took that day, but after lugging a heavy pack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs, but that night, there were no RVs or other campers to make noise, so I closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me to sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted to sleep, but we awoke to a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch dark outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like someone was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent, hearing the noise again. Our old tent had mesh windows, but the backpacking tent we were using had no window. We could only guess at what was making the noise outside our tent. We initially thought an animal got at our food and garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but the noise was too distinct, and it didn't sound like rustling through food wrappers or our camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we didn't know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home to save on weight against the wishes of my girlfriend. The knocking continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we know, whatever was making the noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence, with only the dull buzz of the insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking, voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We could not make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people talking in the distance. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices didn't seem to be getting louder. Whoever was out there did not spot the tent or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At the first light, we slowly got out of the tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anyone was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp pads and put our tent away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word, "kill," was cut into the shelter wall, and there were a number of axe and knife cuts where someone was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and saw a scattering of fresh wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anyone was following us. We traversed the glacial eskers that we saw the day before, and we knew we were getting close to our car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield, and a squirrel carcass was impaled on the wiper blade, hair and blood still stuck to the wiper, and on the hood of the car. I didn't bother cleaning off the car. We threw our gear in the trunk, and I sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the gravel logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I could not see anything through the cloud of road dust behind the car. When we got to a gas station by the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper, and I tried to remove as much dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas, and we didn't stop until we made it to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin.